They kicked her out of first class for her scars, then froze when the pilot saw who she was. The flight attendant's dismissive glance cut deeper than any of the scars that marked her skin. Nobody expected what happened next when the cockpit door swung open. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dr. John Smith felt every stare burn into his skin as he was escorted from first class. The weight of 20 pairs of eyes pressed against him like hot brands, each glance another reminder that he didn't belong. Jennifer Martin walked ahead of him with practiced efficiency, her back straight and professional, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her discomfort. "This way, sir," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Behind him, whispers rippled through the cabin. "Did you see his face?" a woman hissed. Another voice answered, "Shouldn't they have some kind of policy about this?" John clutched his medical journal tighter, his scarred fingers whitening around the edges. The burns that climbed up his neck and jaw felt suddenly hotter, more visible, as if they were fresh rather than 3 years healed. He kept his gaze forward, drawing on the same discipline that had carried him through war zones and operating theaters. Richard Brown's voice carried deliberately from seat 3B. "About time. Some people simply don't understand appropriate boundaries." His wife, Emily, tittered beside him, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the light as she covered her mouth in mock discretion. A child pointed openly until his mother pulled his hand down. The boy's innocent curiosity hurt less than the mother's horrified expression. John walked the gauntlet of the aisle, each step measured and deliberate. He'd face gunfire in Kabul with less dread than this public parade of shame. The humiliation cut deeper than any injury ever had, deeper than the shrapnel that had torn through his body when he'd carried Lieutenant Johnson from that burning hospital. The economy passengers barely looked up as he approached. A small mercy. A serviceman in uniform glanced at him, then looked again with narrowed eyes. John recognized that look, the mental Rolodex of faces from deployments past. Jennifer gestured to a seat in the last row. "We apologize for the inconvenience," she said, the words hollow and rehearsed. "Thank you," John replied simply, his voice steady despite the storm inside. As he settled into the seat beside the lavatory, the fabric worn from countless passengers, he felt something he hadn't experienced since those dark days in the field hospital. Complete isolation in a crowded space. Just as he reached for his seatbelt, the cockpit door at the front of the plane swung open with a decisive click. Captain Robert Johnson stepped into the cabin, his uniform crisp and authoritative. The entire cabin fell silent. Something in the captain's posture commanded attention as his eyes scanned the passengers, searching for someone. Searching for him. Captain Robert Johnson emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp and his posture commanding. The overhead lights caught the 4 gold stripes on his sleeves as he paused at the threshold, scanning the cabin with the practiced vigilance of someone who had seen both the skies and battlefields. His eyes moved methodically across the rows of passengers until they found John in the back of the plane. The captain's expression transformed in an instant. His professional demeanor cracked, revealing layers of emotion beneath. First confusion, then dawning recognition, followed by unmistakable shock. His hand gripped the doorframe as if to steady himself. "It can't be," he whispered, though no one near enough could hear him. The entire cabin noticed the change. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The flight attendants paused their preparations. Even Richard and Emily Brown, still smug in their first-class victory, turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. Robert took a deliberate step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving John. There was something in his gaze that transcended the usual respect afforded to a passenger, something almost reverent, as if he were in the presence of someone extraordinary. "Dr. Smith," he called out, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent aircraft. John straightened in his economy seat, his scarred hands resting on his knees. He squinted slightly, studying the captain's face, searching for recognition in his own memory. The murmurs that had followed John's humiliating walk down the aisle just minutes before had completely died. Every passenger now stared at the doctor, but the nature of their attention had transformed entirely. Where there had been revulsion and judgment, curiosity and wonder now took hold. Lisa Johnson, standing nearby with her service cart, watched the scene unfold with widening eyes. She glanced between the captain and John, sensing the weight of their connection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "please excuse the interruption." He continued walking down the aisle, past the now silent Browns, past the curious onlookers in business class, moving with purpose toward the man who had been banished to the back of the plane. For the first time since boarding, John wasn't being stared at because of his scars. The visible marks of his past were suddenly secondary to whatever the captain had recognized in him, something that commanded not disgust, but awe. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, charged with anticipation and the promise of revelation. That morning, the sun poured through the windows of American Airways Flight 718, casting golden streaks across the cabin. Dr. John Smith settled into seat 2A, his scarred fingers tracing the smooth leather armrest. His other hand unconsciously adjusted his shirt collar, a habitual gesture to hide the burns that climbed his neck like a topographical map of pain. 3 years of surgeries had improved his mobility, but nothing could erase the visible reminders of that day in Kabul. He watched the ground crew hustle on the JFK tarmac, their movements purposeful and synchronized. The baggage handlers tossed luggage with practiced efficiency, while maintenance personnel performed final checks. There was comfort in their routine, a normalcy that John was desperately trying to reclaim for himself. This was his first commercial flight since the accident that had changed everything. The familiar scent of recycled air and upholstery brought back memories, not of civilian travel, but of military transports and medevac flights. John checked his military watch, a habit from his colonel days. 7:15. 45 minutes until takeoff to London. He'd scheduled his follow-up surgeries with a specialist there, despite his doctors in New York advising against international travel so soon. "Some journeys can't wait," he had told them. Outside, the morning light glinted off the aircraft's wing. John found himself mentally reviewing emergency protocols, another habit he couldn't shake. His medical journal sat in his carry-on, the cover worn from constant reference during his research on aviation trauma response. The irony wasn't lost on him, that his work now saved lives on planes worldwide, yet here he sat, an object of whispers and stares. A flight attendant approached, her name tag reading Sarah Davis. She offered a practiced smile that faltered only slightly when she noticed his scars. "Champagne before takeoff, sir?" she asked, her voice professionally warm. "Just water, please," John replied, his voice steady but edged with the discipline forged during his military career. As Sarah moved away, John caught his reflection in the window, a face transformed by fire and shrapnel. He remembered the hospital collapsing around him as he carried the young lieutenant to safety. Sometimes at night, he still heard the screams, still felt the heat of the flames as they licked at his skin. The doctor shifted in his seat, wincing slightly at the twinge in his side where the skin grafts were still healing. Beyond the tarmac, the New York skyline stretched toward clouds. He was leaving American soil again, this time not as a decorated military physician, but as a patient, a survivor trying to piece together what remained of his life after the hero's work was done. 3 years had passed since Dr. John Smith last boarded a commercial flight. 3 years marked by endless surgeries that attempted to rebuild what fire had taken, physical therapy sessions that tested his resolve, and psychological counseling that barely scratched the surface of his trauma. But perhaps the hardest battle was the one he fought each morning with his reflection, a face and body mapped with scars that told stories he wasn't always ready to share. Today's flight to London represented more than just travel. It was a deliberate step toward reclaiming some version of his former life. A new normal, the therapists called it. John called it necessary survival. "Champagne before takeoff, sir?" He looked up to see Sarah Davis, her American Airways uniform perfectly pressed, offering a tray of flutes. Her smile was genuine, not the practiced customer service expression he'd grown accustomed to receiving. She didn't flinch at the sight of his scarred hands or the burn tissue visible above his collar. "Just water, please," he replied. His voice carried the steady cadence that had once commanded military medical units in crisis zones around the world. Old habits died hard, especially those forged under fire. Sarah nodded and returned moments later with a bottle of water. "First time flying with us, Dr. Smith?" "First time flying at all in 3 years," he admitted, his fingers absently tracing the armrest. The last time he'd been airborne was on a military evacuation flight, heavily sedated, his body wrapped in bandages after the Kabul hospital bombing. "Well, we're glad to have you aboard," she said, her eyes briefly registering something. Recognition, perhaps? John wondered if she'd read about the siege, or if his name had triggered some distant memory. He took a small pill case from his jacket pocket and carefully extracted his pain medication. The doctors had warned him about cabin pressure potentially exacerbating his discomfort during the transatlantic journey. He'd dismissed their concerns. He'd endured far worse. John glanced at his military watch, a habit from his colonel days, when timing meant everything in emergency medicine. 7 hours to London. 7 hours to determine if he was truly ready to face the International Medical Conference, where he would present his trauma protocols. The very protocols born from the chaos that had left him scarred. He took a sip of water and gazed out the window at the bustling JFK tarmac. Somewhere between New York and London, he hoped to find pieces of himself that had been lost in the flames 3 years ago. Sarah nodded with quiet understanding, a gesture that momentarily put Dr. John Smith at ease. The moment of tranquility was fleeting, shattered as Richard and Emily Brown swept into the first-class cabin with an air of entitlement that seemed to precede them physically. Emily's diamond bracelet caught the morning light streaming through the windows, sending prisms dancing across the cabin. The expensive piece glittered ostentatiously as she adjusted her designer handbag. Richard Brown, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth rather than taste, guided his wife with a proprietary hand at her lower back. The couple's confident stride faltered when Emily stopped dead in the aisle, her gaze fixed directly on John. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat in an almost theatrical display of shock. John felt her eyes cataloging every ridge and discoloration on his face, the way people often did, as if his scars were exhibits in some macabre museum. "Darling?" Richard questioned, following her line of sight until he too spotted John. His face transformed, features twisting from mild annoyance to unmistakable disdain in the span of seconds. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I thought American Airways had standards for their premium cabins." The words hung in the air like poison. John kept his expression neutral, a skill honed through countless similar encounters since his injuries. He turned his attention back to the window, focusing on the ground crew as they loaded the last of the luggage into the aircraft's belly. Emily whispered something to her husband, her lips barely moving, but her eyes never leaving John. Richard nodded with a smirk that suggested complete agreement with whatever sentiment she'd expressed. Then, like wildfire, the whispers began, soft at first, a rustle of discomfort that grew bolder as more passengers filed into the cabin. John caught fragments, "shouldn't be here," and "makes everyone uncomfortable," and worst of all, "paid the same as us for these seats." A businessman across the aisle shifted noticeably away from John's direction. A woman 2 rows ahead kept turning to steal glances, her face a mixture of morbid curiosity and revulsion. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with professional smiles that never quite reached their eyes, their gazes sliding past John as if he were invisible. The Browns settled into their seats directly across from him, Richard making a show of requesting different champagne from Sarah, clearly establishing his status as a frequent, valued customer. Emily arranged herself carefully, angling her body away from John's direction, while simultaneously ensuring she could observe him from the corner of her eye. John gripped his armrest tighter, feeling the weight of every stare like physical pressure. The cabin had become a battlefield of a different kind, and he was once again under siege. John fixed his gaze on the tarmac, watching ground crew scurry about their duties. The window reflected his face, a topographical map of scars that told stories he rarely shared. The burns stretched from his jawline down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar where the worst damage remained hidden. He knew what was coming. He'd endured it in upscale restaurants, at medical conferences, everywhere public eyes could judge. Emily Brown's diamond bracelet caught the morning light as she flagged Sarah down with a practiced flick of her manicured hand. "A word, please?" The honeyed tone barely masked her contempt. John didn't need to look. He'd heard that particular inflection before, the false politeness people used when they wanted someone like him removed from sight. He clutched his battered medical journal, its worn leather cover embossed with Operation Nightfall in fading gold letters. The weight of it was comforting, a tangible reminder of purpose amid the shame burning through him. His scarred fingers traced the embossing, muscle memory taking him back to the chaos of that night in Kabul. The deafening explosions, the acrid smoke, the screams of the wounded. The hospital had been engulfed in flames within minutes. John remembered the weight of Lieutenant Johnson on his shoulders, the young officers' uniforms smoldering as they stumbled through collapsing corridors. He remembered the 46 other souls he'd managed to shepherd to safety before the building finally surrendered to the inferno. Sarah approached Emily with professional courtesy, but John could see the flight attendant's eyes darting nervously between the wealthy passenger and himself. Richard Brown leaned forward, his expensive watch glinting as he gestured subtly toward John. "We paid for a certain experience," Emily whispered, not quite quietly enough. "And that includes the ambiance." John swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He'd faced gunfire and mortar attacks with less anxiety than this moment of pure social rejection. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he could save dozens of lives, but couldn't save himself from becoming an unwelcome sight. He opened his journal to distract himself, pages filled with his own handwriting detailing trauma protocols that had revolutionized emergency medicine in conflict zones. Protocols now taught in medical schools across America. The same protocols that had earned him commendations and medals, now stored in a box under his bed. The whispers grew louder. John closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for what would inevitably come next. In his mind, he could still hear the helicopter rotors from that night, still feel the heat of the flames against his skin. Sometimes, he thought, surviving was the easy part. A boy of about 8 sat across the aisle, his wide eyes fixed on Dr. John Smith's face. The child made no attempt to hide his curiosity, staring openly at the network of scars that traversed John's cheek and neck. John had grown accustomed to children's reactions. They at least possessed the honesty adults lacked. The boy's father, noticing his son's fascination, leaned over and whispered something in the child's ear. Whatever he said caused the boy to immediately avert his gaze and shrink into his seat, suddenly fascinated by his handheld game. John caught the father's apologetic glance, tinged with discomfort. He checked his military watch, a habit from his days in service that had never left him. 7:42 in the morning. 20 minutes until takeoff. John ran his scarred fingers along the armrest, focusing on the texture beneath his damaged skin, rather than the whispers that continued to circulate through first class. The Browns had been busy. Richard's hushed conversations with nearby passengers had spread like wildfire, and John could feel the atmosphere shifting. What had begun as curious glances had transformed into something more hostile. Emily kept shooting pointed looks toward the flight attendants, her diamond bracelet catching the light each time she raised her hand to get their attention. John opened his medical journal, attempting to lose himself in the familiar terminology of trauma protocols. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd developed procedures to save lives in aircraft emergencies, yet couldn't secure his own seat on a routine flight. "Excuse me, Dr. Smith?" He looked up to find Jennifer Martin, the senior flight attendant, standing beside his seat. Her corporate smile was perfectly in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. John had seen that expression countless times since his injuries. The careful neutrality of someone delivering uncomfortable news. "We seem to have a seating issue," Jennifer continued, her voice professionally modulated. "I'm afraid we'll need to relocate you to another section of the aircraft." No explanation followed. None was needed. John recognized the forced empathy in her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders that betrayed her discomfort with the task. Behind her, he could see Sarah Davis watching the interaction with a troubled expression. "I understand," John replied quietly, already gathering his belongings. He'd learned to pick his battles, and this wasn't one worth fighting. Not today. Jennifer's relief at his compliance was palpable. "Thank you for your understanding, sir. We appreciate your cooperation." As John prepared to stand, he caught sight of Richard Brown watching the interaction with barely concealed satisfaction. The man's smug expression said everything his words didn't need to. John Smith rose with quiet dignity, tucking his medical journal into his carry-on bag. The weight of 24 stares pressed against his scarred skin as he gathered his belongings. His military training had prepared him for many things, but the casual cruelty of civilians still caught him off guard. As he prepared to leave, Richard Brown leaned into the aisle, his expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights. "Some people just don't belong in certain spaces," he announced, voice pitched to carry throughout first class. The businessman's smug expression made it clear who he meant. Emily reached over and patted her husband's arm in mock disapproval. "Richard, please," she whispered, not quite quietly enough. The smirk playing at the corners of her lips betrayed her true feelings. She adjusted her diamond bracelet, the gesture somehow emphasizing the gulf between them and the scarred doctor. Not a single passenger spoke up. The silence was deafening as John made his way down the narrow aisle of American Airways Flight 718. A businessman in seat 4C suddenly became fascinated with his smartphone. A woman in 5B pulled her designer handbag closer to her body as he passed, as if his disfigurement might somehow be contagious. The walk felt endless. Each step carried John further from the comfort he'd briefly allowed himself to hope for. He kept his gaze forward, shoulders squared, the same posture that had carried him through burning buildings in Kabul. His fingers instinctively brushed against his military watch, the familiar texture grounding him in the moment. A child pointed only to have his mother quickly grab the small hand and whisper a harsh admonishment. The boy's eyes remained wide with fascination and fear. John had seen that look before, in war zones, in hospitals, in mirrors. As he passed row 12, a flight attendant averted her eyes, finding sudden interest in adjusting a passenger's tray table. The practiced corporate smiles had vanished, replaced by uncomfortable glances and avoidance. John's mind drifted to the protocols he developed after the siege, procedures designed to save lives in crisis situations. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could save these people in an emergency, yet they couldn't bear to sit beside him during a routine flight. By the time he reached the back of the aircraft, the humiliation had settled into a familiar ache. Not unlike the pain from his physical injuries, this was just another battlefield, he reminded himself. Different weapons, same wounds. The economy cabin felt like a different world. Passengers were engrossed in their own small universes, Earbuds in, books open, children being hushed. They barely glanced at Dr. John Smith as he made his way down the narrow aisle, their indifference almost a relief after the scrutiny he'd endured in first class. About halfway down, a man in military dress blues looked up from his magazine. Sergeant David Brown's eyes narrowed, his posture straightening instinctively. John caught the recognition in his gaze, not disgust, but something closer to disbelief. The serviceman opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it, watching intently as John continued his journey of shame. The flight attendant led him to the very last row, beside the lavatory. "This is all we have available," she said, her corporate smile never wavering. The unspoken message was clear. This was where people like him belonged, out of sight. John nodded, squeezing into the seat that barely accommodated his frame. The constant hum of the bathroom fan and the occasional flush would be his companions for the next 7 hours to London. He slid his medical journal into the seat pocket, its title, Advanced Trauma Protocols for Aviation Emergencies, staring back at him with bitter irony. The man who had written guidelines to save lives during aviation disasters was now treated as unworthy of basic dignity on an aircraft. A child across the aisle pointed at his face until her mother gently redirected her attention. John was used to children's curiosity. It was honest, at least, unlike the performative disgust of adults like Richard and Emily Brown. He pulled down the tray table, noticing it was slightly sticky from a previous passenger. The contrast with the immaculate surfaces of first class couldn't have been more stark. Through the small window, he could see the wing of the American Airways aircraft, the company logo, a reminder of the corporate policies that had allowed his humiliation to proceed unchallenged. The serviceman was still watching him, John realized. There was something in his eyes, not pity, but something deeper. Had they met before? In Kabul, perhaps? John had treated so many, carried so many through fire and rubble. The faces sometimes blurred together in his memory, much like his scars had blurred his own reflection. He leaned his head back against the seat, feeling the familiar ache in his side, where shrapnel remained embedded too close to vital organs to remove. The newspaper on the empty seat beside him caught his attention. Its headline bold and black, 5 years since Kabul siege. A newspaper lay folded on the empty seat beside John, its bold headline catching his eye. 5 years since Kabul siege, remembering the fallen. His throat tightened as memories flooded back. The heat, the screams, the weight of responsibility as he'd worked to evacuate the wounded under relentless fire. He looked away, focusing instead on the clouds outside the small window, trying to steady his breathing. Lisa Johnson approached quietly, her uniform crisp despite the turbulence they'd encountered during takeoff. The young flight attendant slipped him a bottle of water, her eyes conveying genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry about what happened up there," she said softly, glancing toward first class. "It's not right. Not right at all." Dr. Smith accepted the water with his scarred hand, the tissue damage still evident despite numerous surgeries. "Thank you," he replied, twisting the cap open with practiced movements. "Some scars are just easier to see than others." His voice carried the weight of experience but lacked self-pity. Lisa lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Can I get you anything else? A pillow, perhaps?" John shook his head, offering a tired smile that barely reached his eyes. As he reached for his medication in his carry-on, he caught fragments of conversation from the galley where 2 crew members spoke in hushed tones. He saw Browns are major shareholders. 30% of company stock. Can't exactly tell them no. Something he deemed as completely unfair treatment. He swallowed his pills with a long drink of water. The irony wasn't lost on him. How quickly people's perceptions could shift based on appearance alone. In the operating theater or on the battlefield, his colleagues had seen past his exterior to the steady hands and quick thinking that saved lives. Here, he was just another damaged person to be shuffled away. The serviceman 3 rows ahead kept glancing back, a question in his eyes. John nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a silent communication between those who understood service and sacrifice. The newspaper headline continued to pull at him. 5 years. Sometimes it felt like yesterday, other times like another lifetime entirely. He slipped the journal from his bag, running his fingers over the embossed title, Advanced Trauma Protocols for Aviation Emergencies. The protocols he'd developed after Kabul had become standard training for flight crews worldwide, yet here he sat, relegated to the back row by the very industry his work had helped make safer. John tucked the journal into the seat pocket and leaned his head back, closing his eyes. The medication would dull the persistent pain in his side soon enough. For now, he would rest and prepare for London, where colleagues awaited who would see the doctor, not just the scars. Lisa Johnson leaned over, her voice hushed as she collected empty cups from the row ahead. "The captain seemed really interested when he saw your name on the passenger list, Dr. Smith. Asked me twice if you were actually on board." John furrowed his brow, trying to place the name Robert Johnson in his memory. During his years of service, he'd encountered hundreds of military personnel, faces blurred together in a haze of battlefield chaos and hospital tents. The painkillers didn't help his recall either. "I've known many Johnsons," he replied, absently running his fingers along the edge of his medical journal. "But the military is a big place." The steady rumble of the engines vibrated through the cabin, creating a white noise that John found unexpectedly comforting. It reminded him of the medevac helicopters, machines that had once carried him and countless wounded soldiers across hostile territories. Those flights had been terrifying, yet reassuring. Each minute airborne meant being 1 minute closer to proper medical care. "Is there anything else I can get you?" Lisa asked, genuine concern in her eyes. "I'm fine, thank you," John said with a slight smile. The young flight attendant nodded and continued her duties, but not before giving his shoulder a gentle, supportive touch. A few rows ahead, Sergeant David Brown turned in his seat again, offering a respectful nod when their eyes met. Unlike the passengers in first class, the serviceman's gaze held no judgment, only what appeared to be recognition and deep respect. John wondered if they had crossed paths before, perhaps in one of the field hospitals. The sergeant's uniform was impeccably pressed, his posture military straight even in the cramped economy seat. Something about him seemed familiar, but John couldn't place it. Too many faces, too many wounded men and women he'd treated over the years. John shifted in his seat, wincing slightly as his scarred skin pulled against the fabric of his shirt. He glanced out the small window at the vast expanse of clouds below. Somewhere in his memory, a young lieutenant named Johnson was calling for help, trapped beneath rubble as flames engulfed a hospital wing. But was it the same Johnson now flying this plane? The doctor closed his eyes, letting the aircraft's vibrations lull him into a state between wakefulness and sleep. In this liminal space, fragments of memories flickered like old film reels. Urgent voices, the smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke. Hands steady despite the chaos around him. When he opened his eyes again, the serviceman was still watching him, a look of quiet reverence on his face that spoke volumes more than words ever could. As the plane taxied along the runway, Dr. John Smith felt the familiar vibration through the uncomfortable economy seat. The painkillers he'd taken earlier were finally dulling the persistent ache in his side, one of many souvenirs from that fateful day in Kabul. His doctors at the military hospital had warned him about flying so soon after his latest reconstructive surgery, but some journeys couldn't be postponed. The conference in London on advanced trauma protocols was too important. Lives depended on the research he was presenting. Through the small window, John observed dark storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather matched his mood, turbulent and threatening. Almost unconsciously, his mind began cycling through emergency protocols, calculating evacuation times and mentally noting the nearest exits. Old habits from his military days died hard, especially for someone who had seen how quickly situations could deteriorate. "We're expecting some light turbulence once we reach cruising altitude," Lisa Johnson announced over the intercom, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with Jennifer Martin's earlier coldness. "Please keep your seatbelts fastened when seated." The engines roared louder as the aircraft accelerated. John gripped the armrests, his scarred fingers whitening slightly as the plane lifted off the JFK tarmac. The familiar pressure pushed him back into his seat, a sensation that once meant he was heading into a combat zone rather than a medical conference. As American Airways Flight 718 climbed steadily through the clouds, John caught a glimpse of the first-class cabin. Richard and Emily Brown were toasting with champagne flutes, seemingly celebrating their victory in having him removed. The diamond bracelet on Emily's wrist caught the cabin light as she laughed at something her husband said. John wondered if they were discussing him, the scarred man they deemed unworthy of sharing their rarefied air. The serviceman seated several rows ahead turned slightly, catching John's eye with a respectful nod. There was something familiar about him that John couldn't quite place. Had they served together? In his years as a military doctor, John had treated thousands of soldiers. The plane banked gently as it headed east toward the Atlantic. John reached for the bottle of water Lisa had kindly provided and washed down another painkiller. The journey to London would take nearly 7 hours, plenty of time to review his presentation, and perhaps enough time to remember why Captain Robert Johnson's name stirred something in his memory. Outside, the storm clouds grew darker, swallowing the aircraft as it climbed toward cruising altitude. John closed his eyes, trying to focus on the future rather than the past that had marked him so visibly. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Dr. John Smith gazed out the small window beside him. The clouds below resembled the smoke that had filled the Kabul hospital corridors. He wondered how Richard and Emily Brown would react if they knew who he really was, not just a scarred face to be removed from their pristine first-class experience, but the man credited with saving 47 lives during one of the most horrific sieges in recent military history. That was the thing about scars, he reflected. People only saw the damage, never the strength it took to survive. Each mark on his skin told a story of someone he'd managed to save, often at great cost to himself. The worst burn along his jawline came from carrying a child through a collapsing doorway. The jagged line across his left hand was from shielding a wounded soldier from falling debris. The aircraft hit a pocket of turbulence, causing several passengers to gasp and grip their armrests. John remained perfectly still, his hands steady on his tray table. After performing surgery during mortar attacks, a little airplane turbulence hardly registered as concerning. He noticed the serviceman a few rows ahead watching him with quiet respect, nodding slightly when their eyes met. His thoughts drifted to the captain, Robert Johnson. The name tugged at his memory, stirring something in the fog of faces he'd encountered during those chaotic days. John had treated so many during the siege. Some he'd saved, others he couldn't. The military was smaller than civilians realized. Paths often crossed in unexpected ways. The turbulence intensified briefly. A child began crying somewhere in the cabin, but John's medical instincts noted it was fear, not pain. He took a sip of water, his scarred fingers wrapping around the plastic bottle Lisa had kindly provided. There was something about the captain's voice over the intercom that seemed familiar, the cadence, the controlled calm. John closed his eyes, trying to place it. Was Johnson one of the pilots who'd flown medevac missions? Or perhaps one of the wounded he'd treated in the field hospital? The plane steadied, and John opened his medical journal again, though his mind wasn't on the text. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from decorated military surgeon to a man escorted to the back of a plane because his appearance made wealthy shareholders uncomfortable. He ran his fingers over the embossed title of his journal. The protocols he'd developed had saved countless lives, yet here he sat, deemed unfit for first class because of the very scars he'd earned saving others. The irony wasn't lost on him, as the aircraft continued its steady course toward London, carrying its passengers through skies he'd once crossed on much more dangerous missions. Lisa returned to the back of the plane, a folded airline blanket in her hands. She placed it gently on John's lap, her eyes briefly lingering on the scarred hands that had saved so many. "It gets cold back here," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the engines. "The heating isn't as good in economy." She hesitated, then added with genuine admiration, "I read your paper on the Kabul protocols. The emergency response framework you developed? You saved so many lives." John's eyes sharpened with interest, the fatigue momentarily lifting from his face. It had been months since anyone had recognized his work, rather than just his scars. "You're in medicine?" he asked, studying the young flight attendant with newfound curiosity. "Part-time EMT, studying on the side," Lisa replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "Your trauma stabilization techniques are part of our standard training now. The way you managed to improvise medical equipment during the siege?" She shook her head in wonder. "It's revolutionary." John adjusted the blanket, his fingers tracing the edge of the fabric. For a moment, he was transported back to the makeshift hospital in Kabul, where blankets like this had been used as improvised stretchers, pressure bandages, and even surgical drapes. "The best innovations come from necessity," he said softly. "When you have nothing but need to save someone?" Lisa nodded eagerly. "That's exactly why I'm studying emergency medicine. To be prepared when resources aren't available." A small smile crossed John's face, the first genuine one since boarding the aircraft. He reached for his journal in the seat pocket, considering sharing some of his newer research with someone who might actually appreciate it. Before he could respond further, the aircraft speakers crackled to life, and Captain Robert Johnson's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Weather conditions look favorable for our flight to London today." There was a brief pause. "As is tradition on American Airways international flights, I'll be coming out shortly to greet our passengers personally." John froze at the announcement, his hands still on the journal. Something about the captain's voice tugged at distant memories. Memories of smoke and screams, of collapsed buildings and desperate prayers. The doctor's pulse quickened as fragments of recollection began assembling themselves in his mind. Lisa noticed his sudden tension. "Are you all right, Dr. Smith?" But John barely heard her, his attention fixed on the cockpit door at the front of the plane, waiting for it to open. "This is Captain Robert Johnson. We're at cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Weather looks good for most of our journey to London, with some light turbulence expected over the Atlantic. I'll be coming out to greet everyone shortly, as is tradition on American Airways international flights." The announcement crackled through the cabin speakers, but John Smith barely registered the words about weather or altitude. His mind locked onto that name, Robert Johnson. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, causing tiny ripples across the surface of the dark liquid. Robert Johnson. The memories crashed through the carefully constructed walls in his mind. A young lieutenant with determined eyes, trapped under a collapsed beam in the burning Kabul hospital. The smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke. The deafening explosions outside. The way the young man had gripped John's wrist and whispered, "Leave me, Doc. Save yourself." The weight of the officer's body as John carried him through flames when everyone else had given up. John set down his cup, his scarred fingers suddenly unsteady. He hadn't made the connection when he boarded. Johnson was a common name after all. But how many Robert Johnsons had been in Kabul 5 years ago? How many had been pulled from that inferno? "Are you all right, sir?" Lisa Johnson leaned down, concern etching her features. "You've gone pale." "I'm fine," John managed, his voice hoarse. "Just memories." Lisa nodded sympathetically, misunderstanding the source of his distress. The turbulence should pass soon. John barely heard her. His mind raced through possibilities. If this was the same Robert Johnson, what would happen when they came face to face? Would the captain even remember him? The burns had altered John's appearance significantly since that day. The serviceman across the aisle, Sergeant David Brown, was watching him with quiet intensity, as if sensing the storm brewing inside the doctor. The soft chime of the cockpit door unlocking pulled John's attention forward. His heart hammered against his ribs, the familiar sensation of adrenaline flooding his system. The same biochemical reaction he'd experienced countless times in combat zones. The cockpit door swung open. John's breath caught in his throat as Captain Robert Johnson stepped into the aisle, his uniform crisp and authoritative, his posture military straight despite the years of civilian flying. John gripped the armrests, his knuckles white, as the captain began making his way through first class, exchanging pleasantries with passengers who had no idea of the history potentially walking among them. Captain Robert Johnson moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, his uniform impeccable as he greeted passengers with the warm professionalism that had earned American Airways its reputation. He paused at row 3, where Richard and Emily Brown sat enjoying their champagne. "Mr. and Mrs. Brown, always a pleasure to have our shareholders aboard," Robert said, shaking Richard's hand firmly. Emily beamed, adjusting her diamond bracelet as she accepted the captain's greeting. "Wonderful service as always, Captain," Richard replied, his earlier disdain completely absent from his voice now. "We were just saying how smoothly everything's running today." Robert nodded politely and continued down the aisle, exchanging pleasantries with other first-class passengers. His routine was interrupted when his gaze drifted toward the back of the plane. There, seated in the last row, was a face he'd never forget, though it was now marked by scars that told a story few could comprehend. The captain stopped mid-sentence, his hand frozen in a half-completed gesture. The passenger he'd been addressing looked up in confusion, but Robert's attention had completely shifted. Recognition flickered across his face, then transformed into something deeper, more profound. Reverence. Without explanation, he straightened his posture and walked purposefully toward the back of the aircraft. Passengers watched curiously as the captain moved against the usual flow of authority, heading toward economy class with determination in every step. When he reached the last row, Robert stood tall, his eyes never leaving John Smith's face. The doctor looked up, surprise evident in his expression, as memories connected between them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced, his voice carrying throughout the cabin without the intercom. The plane fell silent. "I apologize for interrupting your flight, but I need to acknowledge someone special on board today." Passengers craned their necks, some standing slightly to see what was happening. Even the flight attendants paused their service. 5 years ago, during the Kabul siege, when our military hospital came under attack, this man, Dr. John Smith, saved 47 lives while the building collapsed around us. Robert's voice carried emotion rarely heard from airline captains, including mine. A collective gasp moved through the cabin. In first class, Emily Brown's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Her husband's expression shifted from annoyance to discomfort. When the evacuation order came, Colonel Dr. Smith refused to leave his patients. When fire cut off our escape, he created a path through impossible conditions. Robert's voice grew stronger with each word. The protocols he developed that day are now taught to every airline crew worldwide. The reason I'm standing here, the reason many of us are safer in the skies, is because of this man. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady hum of the engines carrying them across the Atlantic. Sergeant David Brown rose from his seat, his uniform crisp but his voice anything but steady. His fingers trembled slightly as he stood at attention. "Sergeant David Brown, sir, my brother's alive because of Dr. Smith," he announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "He was trapped in the hospital wing during the siege. The doctors had given up, but Colonel Smith went back in, said he wouldn't leave anyone behind." A wave of whispers swept through the cabin like wind through tall grass. Passengers who had earlier avoided looking at John now stared openly, their expressions transforming from discomfort to awe. Some leaned into the aisle to get a better view of the man they had collectively shunned. Captain Robert Johnson nodded solemnly. The protocols Dr. Smith developed after Kabul are now standard for every airline crew worldwide, he explained, his voice carrying authority that commanded attention. His emergency response procedures have been implemented on every major carrier. He's the reason we're all safer today. An elderly woman near the front clutched her husband's arm. I read about him in the Times, she whispered. Though in the hushed cabin, her words carried. They called him the Angel of Kabul. John sat perfectly still, his military discipline evident in his posture. The weight of 47 souls saved, and those he couldn't save, pressed upon his shoulders. He'd never sought recognition for what he considered simply doing his duty. A businessman who had earlier pulled his briefcase closer when John passed now looked ashamed, studying the floor intently. Near him, a mother explained quietly to her curious child, "That man is a hero, sweetheart." For the first time since boarding, John's scars were seen for what they really were, badges of courage, testaments to running toward danger when others fled. The tissue that pulled at his face and hands, once objects of revulsion, now told a story of sacrifice that everyone could read. Lisa Johnson stood nearby, pride evident in her stance. She'd recognized his name from her emergency medicine textbooks, where his innovations had saved countless lives beyond those he'd personally rescued. He developed the airway management technique we use in our training, she told a nearby passenger. When seconds count, his method saves minutes. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had been a space of judgment had become one of reverence. Even in economy class, with its cramped seats and constant noise from the lavatory, John Smith now sat in a bubble of respect that no first-class ticket could purchase. Sergeant Brown remained standing, his salute unwavering, a living testament to the ripple effect of one man's courage. Captain Robert Johnson moved down the aisle with purpose, his uniform crisp and his eyes fixed on John. When he reached him, the pilot stood at attention and offered a formal salute that spoke volumes. "Colonel Dr. John Smith, Angel of Kabul," Robert announced, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I never got to thank you properly." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning and shared history. John rose slowly, his military training taking over, as he returned the salute. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, survivors of the same hell, connected by the thin thread of life that John had refused to let break. Other military passengers throughout the aircraft began to stand. The serviceman, Sergeant David Brown, was first, his posture straightening as he saluted. Then another near the front, and two more from economy. Like a wave, they rose, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of those who had served. In first class, Richard and Emily Brown sat frozen, champagne glasses still in hand. Emily's diamond bracelet caught the cabin light as she shifted uncomfortably. Around them, the atmosphere had transformed from casual disdain to collective shame. "The protocols you developed saved my brother's life," Sergeant Brown called out, "and countless others since." Lisa Johnson stepped forward, John's medical journal clutched respectfully in her hands. The embossed title Operation Nightfall faced outward for all to see. "I knew it was you from the moment I saw your name on the manifest," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious admiration. "You inspired me to go into emergency medicine. Your papers on battlefield triage adaptations for civilian emergencies changed everything." John accepted the journal with a nod, his scarred fingers brushing against its familiar cover. The burns that had made him an outcast now served as testimony to his courage. "Just doing my job," he replied quietly, but his words carried weight. A woman in economy spoke up. "My daughter was on that flight from Dubai 3 years ago. The one that had to emergency land," They use your protocols. The entire atmosphere of the aircraft shifted. What had been whispers of disgust transformed into murmurs of respect. Passengers who had earlier pulled away now leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the man they had so quickly judged. Sarah Davis watched from the galley, her earlier discomfort replaced by understanding. Jennifer Martin stood beside her, corporate smile gone, genuine respect taking its place. For the first time since boarding, John stood tall, his scars no longer symbols of otherness, but badges of honor, earned in service to others. Walking down the aisle beside Captain Robert Johnson, Dr. John Smith felt a surreal shift in the atmosphere. The same passengers who had earlier averted their eyes now reached out, eager to make contact with the Angel of Kabul. A middle-aged woman grasped his scarred hand with both of hers, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, "My nephew is alive because of doctors like you." The serviceman, Sergeant David Brown, stood at attention, offering a crisp salute that spoke volumes more than words could. John nodded acknowledgments, his military discipline evident in his posture, despite the pain medication dulling his senses. The weight of recognition felt both validating and uncomfortable. This public adoration was the exact opposite of the shame he'd endured just 30 minutes earlier. As they approached the first-class cabin, Richard and Emily Brown stood awkwardly in the aisle, their earlier confidence evaporated. Emily's diamond bracelet no longer sparkled with superiority, but seemed to catch the harsh light of judgment now turned upon them. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her silk scarf. "We had no idea," Emily stammered, her voice lacking its previous authority. Richard stood beside her, his face ashen, eyes darting between the doctor and the other passengers, who now watched this encounter with undisguised interest. John paused, studying the couple who had orchestrated his humiliation. The cabin fell silent, the only sound the steady hum of the aircraft engines as they pushed through the storm clouds outside. "Would it have mattered if I was anyone else?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying in the hushed cabin. "Or are my scars only acceptable because of who I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Several passengers shifted in their seats, recognition dawning on their faces, not just of John's identity, but of their own complicity in judging him by his appearance. Emily opened her mouth, but found no words. Richard stared at the floor, the shame evident in his rigid posture. Lisa Johnson, standing nearby with a service tray, caught John's eye and gave him a small nod of respect. Senior attendant Jennifer Martin watched from the galley, her corporate smile replaced by genuine contemplation. Captain Johnson placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Your seat is waiting," he said, gesturing toward the cockpit. As they moved forward, leaving the Browns in stunned silence, the weight of John's question remained, challenging everyone on American Airways Flight 718 to examine not just who deserved respect, but why they offered it in the first place. Captain Robert Johnson led Dr. John Smith through the narrow aisle toward the cockpit, his posture straightening with each step. "Your seat is up here, where you belong," he said, gesturing to the jump seat with a reverence that spoke volumes. The small space felt sacred somehow, a sanctuary from the judgment John had endured for years. As John settled into the seat, his military training evident in his precise movements, a red warning light began blinking on the control panel. Robert's expression shifted from warm welcome to focused concern. "Electrical anomaly in the secondary systems," he explained, his fingers dancing across the switches. John leaned forward, his medical instincts for diagnosis transferring seamlessly to this mechanical patient. "Looks like a cascading failure pattern," John observed, "similar to what we saw in those field hospitals when generators would overload." The first officer exchanged a glance with Robert, impressed by the doctor's quick analysis. Outside, dark clouds enveloped the aircraft, the turbulence a physical manifestation of the tension building in the cockpit. "If we don't isolate it, we could lose navigation systems," Robert said, his voice calm despite the gravity of his words. John's scarred hands moved with surprising grace as he helped Robert work through the emergency checklist. The two men fell into a rhythm born from their shared past. Two survivors who understood that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Try bypassing the tertiary circuit, John suggested. In trauma, sometimes you have to sacrifice a minor system to preserve the critical ones. Robert nodded, implementing the suggestion. The warning light flickered, then stabilized to a steady amber. The plane steadied as they worked together, the doctor and the pilot, each applying their expertise to save everyone aboard. Through the cockpit windows, the storm clouds suddenly parted, revealing a breathtaking golden sunrise that bathed the cabin in warm light. It felt like a metaphor John couldn't ignore, darkness giving way to unexpected beauty. "We make a good team, Colonel," Robert said quietly, just like before. John gazed at the horizon, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The humiliation in first class seemed distant now, transformed by recognition and respect. "You know," John said, watching the sun climb higher, "I've spent years hiding these scars, ashamed of how people see them. But today, I realize something." Robert looked at him, waiting. "These marks don't just show where we've been hurt. They prove we had the courage to keep going when everything burned around us." The captain nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And sometimes," John finished, "the world finally sees us for who we truly are." Below them, the vast Atlantic stretched out, a reminder that some journeys change us forever, and that true healing comes not from hiding our scars, but from finding those who see the strength behind them.